To follow up on our initial conversation, I'm delighted to be speaking to Nick Saltmarsh, co-founder of Hodmedods, for another deep dive into the world of sustainable farming and delicious food. Because at Mother Root we're passionate about the kind of link between how things are farmed, where things come from, the impact on taste, flavour, the people who farm it, and the joy that we ultimately get from it being on our plates or in our glasses. So we were speaking about your story and how things got started, but I'd love to move on to talk about some of the challenges that you've experienced from once you decided to get to found Hodmedods back in 2012. Where, you know, what motivated you to get going, and what were the initial challenges that you experienced upon starting?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, what motivated us was essentially two desires. One, to get more diversity of plant-based whole foods into our diets, and the other to see more diversity on British farms, and in particular in British arable farming. And those two things obviously go hand in hand, because the wider range of diverse crops that we can source from British farms, the more different foods we're able to offer. And yeah, that's what's really motivated us. The challenge, a whole load of challenges have been to identify where there are opportunities to diversify production, and then work with farmers to produce those crops in a viable way year after year. So when we started, in fact, before we started, we were just thinking about looking at a source of vegetable protein for a city like Norwich, and at the time, we thought, you know, maybe chickpeas or lentils would be the answer, but we dismissed those as too difficult. You know, they were crops that weren't in production in the UK, and we thought it would be too much of a challenge to get them grown on British farms. So we started with fava beans, which were being grown here anyway, and that was a relatively easy place to start, because we could tap into production where farmers were already growing these beans, either for livestock feed or for export to countries like Egypt and elsewhere in North Africa and the Middle East, where they're widely eaten. And from that point, we were then able to start working with organic farmers as well, to get organic production up and running, and then to look at a wider range of crops. That was a relatively easy starting point. Chickpeas and lentils were totally new crops, and so we dismissed them at the time. But then later on, we were actually talking to a group of Austrian farmers who had started producing lentils in Austria, and we were talking to them about what we thought might be the difficulties and challenges of growing lentils, and they said, just give it a go. Just try growing the lentils and see what happens. So we did that initially on a very small scale, because we weren't at all confident that lentils would be able to be grown successfully in the UK. But the first small scale trials were successful, so then we did slightly larger small field scale trials the next year. And over the last 6 years, we've really been working with a growing group of farmers growing lentils now on a reasonable field scale and producing them in reasonable volumes. And that has been challenging, because it's challenging to work out how to grow new crops in the UK, to choose the right varieties that are going to grow here well, not just 1 year, if the weather happens to be favourable, but year after year, reliably and viably for the farmers. And then also to find the right processes to grow the crop, to keep the weeds down, and then to harvest them, because I mean, lentil plants are almost like a miniature pea plant, and they have tiny pods with 1 or 2 lentils in each one. Now they can be combined, but you've got to get the timing right when the lentils are ripe, before the pods shatter and the lentils get sort of spilt in the field, but when they're dry enough to harvest by combine and then thresh out of the pods. And that's, yeah, I mean, those are just some of the challenges with that one crop in particular. And really we've been working on a whole range of crops and having a whole set of challenges particular to each different crop. And then even after they're harvested, the further challenge is getting the crop processed. After it's harvested, there's always, you know, bits of the plant and occasional stones and mud balls picked up from the field and so on that need to be cleaned out. So we've had to get to know a group of seed and grain processors and really get to know them well, and then identify which processor is going to be best placed to clean up particular crops and get them into a state where they're good for us to eat. And then they come to us, and we then get them packed up and then get them out to customers. And so as every stage has its challenges, but those are just some of the key ones.
It's just an unbelievable process that I think a lot of people are really unaware of, how things end up on your plate, and the challenges that are, take to get from one place to another, especially when you think about like something as humble as a fava bean, like as you said, that has been growing for centuries and is really something that is very much a British crop, and then but not something that's particularly fashionable, or perhaps it's coming back now, which is great, because it was for a while seen as just kind of your everyday, not a dish for poor people, and we stopped celebrating it and enjoying it.
So in fact, that was a whole, sorry, just to chip in, that was a whole set of other challenges. When we started with the fava beans, I was explaining how the production side of it was relatively easy because they were already in production. But with the fava beans, we had the challenge that they were virtually completely unknown in Britain, although they're a very traditional historic crop. As you say, they'd fallen out of favour, they'd become deeply unfashionable hundreds of years ago. We just stopped eating them, to the point where when we started, barely anyone knew what a fava bean was or what to do with it. So we had the whole challenge of communicating what these beans were, how you could cook them, getting recipes available so people would know what to do with them and be inspired to try them. And what we've found is that once people try them and cook them once, then they're very likely to want to keep cooking them. But you've got to get people to try something unfamiliar that first time, which isn't always easy.
And I guess for encouraging farmers that you want to work with to actually grow these crops and maybe work in a different way, work the land in a different way, and try new crops, you also have to show that there's that demand as well, and it doesn't always necessarily coincide at the same time.
Yeah, it's a difficult balance, because if you're working with something new, there isn't necessarily an existing market for it, and you've got to create the market at the same time as getting production up and running. And often with these sorts of crops, processing them is something that happens in volume. The processing lines rely on large volumes because they're designed to process high volume crops like wheat or pulses like peas and so on, which are harvested and traded in significant volume. So what we were trying to do of looking at more specialized production of smaller quantities was quite difficult to square with that. And it's a difficult balancing act to match the production and the demand.
But I think it's very timely, and I think more and more people with plant-based diets, people being concerned with environmental footprint and so on, are looking to ingredients afresh. And can you explain your approach to farming, why these where pulses and legumes are particularly good from that perspective, and how you farm with that in mind?
Yeah, so pulses are a fantastic crop, and farmers like growing them for several reasons. So what pulses are essentially the edible seeds of leguminous plants, and leguminous plants have this fantastic property that they work in symbiosis with bacteria that live in sort of nodules on their roots in the soil. And these bacteria are able to take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and make it available to the plant. And that provides the fertility. Nitrogen is one of the main things that plants need in terms of fertility to grow. So that symbiotic relationship with the bacteria makes nitrogen available to the plant. And this is something that leguminous plants are particularly good at. Some other plants do it to a very lesser extent, but with leguminous plants, they really will fix quite significant amounts of nitrogen, to the extent that you very rarely need to put any artificial fertilizer on a crop of pulses, because all that fertility is provided by the nitrogen fixing bacteria. And even more so, the crop may well leave a legacy of nitrogen in the soil, that can then benefit another crop of a different, a different species, like, wheat or another cereal, can benefit from that nitrogen legacy in the soil. So legumes are really magical in that way. And if we're looking at the impact of the food we eat, one of the biggest impacts in terms of carbon, if you're growing crops, is the fertilizer you need to apply to the crop to help it grow, and particularly to increase the yields. And legumes can really help us to reduce the use of fertilizer for the pulses themselves, but also, as I've said, for other crops. And that can significantly reduce the carbon impact of arable farming. So pulses are great in that respect. They're also a fantastic break crop in that they're, a completely different set of species from cereals and other common crops. So they provide a break that stops the build-up of pests and diseases in their tracks. So if you grow cereals year after year, you have the problem that you're making the same demand on the soil, but you're also allowing pests that attack cereals just to increase year after year, because they have the cereals they want to feed on and attack available to them. But if you grow pulses for a year in the rotation, then suddenly the pests have got nothing to feed on, and they're knocked back. So pulses are great in that respect. They also help to foster soil biodiversity and increase the health and the structure of soils. So yeah, they're all round a good thing. Plus, they're really healthy, nutritious, and delicious. And one often feels, talking about pulses, that there's almost too much going for them. You feel a bit evangelical talking about the wonder and the magic of pulses.
It's too good to be true.
Yeah, although it is true.
It is true, though. And then just kind of picking up from the nutritional perspective, are there practices the ways of farming that actually can impact the nutritional value when it comes to pulses, or are they just straight up good, even if you're using them as a break? So you say you've got poor soils and you put pulses in there, will they still have the same nutritional density, or is it something that actually, is there a specific way to kind of manage the land from the perspective of health of the soil and the nutritional value of the crop?
Yes, so they are fundamentally nutritious. So really, however you grow pulses, and it's one of the other benefits of pulses, is that they're very adaptable. They, for the most part, need very little water, so that's another benefit, that they need very little irrigation. And there are different pulses suited to growing, in different conditions all around the world, but for almost every condition you want to grow something in, there's a pulse that's suited to it. So there are some that will do very well in very dry conditions and on quite poor soils, and others that in our climate, like perhaps slightly heavier soils. So they're always nutritious, and they are also very high in protein, and often that's what people see as the main benefit of pulses, that they're a high protein plant crop. But if anything, the nutrient that's perhaps more significant in pulses is fibre, and also resistant starch, because they're very high in fibre, and they're also high in resistant starch, which is a type of starch that isn't digested in our upper gut. It makes it all the way down to the lower gut, where it feeds our microbiome. So pulses can really benefit our gut health because of the fibre and the resistant starch that they contain. So that certainly, I think in Britain, where we have plenty of protein in our diet, it's probably the fibre and the resistant starch, along with a whole range of sort of vitamins and minerals and other micronutrients as well, that are the main benefit for us of pulses.
Yeah. And then I guess moving on from the nutritional value, I'd like to kind of talk about taste. And something that we began discussing in the last video was how moving from these pulses as something seen as a commodity to something that's seen as having really diverse tastes, and talking about provenance, and that's something you've championed. Can you explain a bit more along that side?
Yes, yeah. So we've been keen to look at as wide a range of different pulses, and then also other crops as well, as possible, to really discover the variety and the range of different flavours that you get from those different varieties, and particularly with peas. When people think about pulses, they probably think mainly of beans and chickpeas and lentils, and peas are sort of the forgotten pulse. I think in Britain we think of peas mainly as something fresh or more likely frozen
Yeah.
that you eat, you know, green. Whereas historically peas were almost always grown like the fava beans, to be fully mature and harvested when they're fully ripe and dry, and then stored through the year. And if you harvest your peas dry, then they really manifest their full character. So rather than all peas being green, you find that when you look at different varieties of dried pea, you get you get the slightly blue peas that are used more commonly to make split green peas. You get the yellow peas, which are also used to make split yellow peas. But then there are marrowfat peas, which have the much more sort of wrinkly, dimpled appearance. There's a type of pea even called wrinkled peas, which are the type that are most commonly harvested to be frozen. But if you let them dry, you get a small pea that has distinctive wrinkles in it. And then perhaps most excitingly of all, there are the carlin peas, which are dark brown or sometimes reddish brown peas that if you look very closely at their skin, they have an amazing marbled appearance. And they have a really distinctive, delicious sort of chestnutty flavour. And if anything, a Britain's sort of original answer to the chickpea, or alternative to the chickpea. And you can use them in cooking in any way you might use a chickpea, but they are a traditional old pea variety of Britain. Very little known these days, except in pockets of the country like Lancashire, where if you go to Preston Market, there's actually a stall selling what's called parched peas, which are these dark brown carlin peas boiled up and then just served in a cup with salt and vinegar. And it's an absolutely delicious, very simple, traditional street food that deserves to be known a lot more widely, and carlin peas deserve to be known a lot more widely. So we've tried to rediscover some of this great variety of peas, and encourage people to see that, to look beyond the frozen green pea and see that peas of British provenance and coming from different farmers of these different varieties really have a huge amount to offer in terms of range and delicious variety of ingredients in our cooking.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think what's coming to mind from my own background, having worked in wine for a decade before moving to non-alcoholic drinks, is this notion of terroir. Does that exist to you? Do you think it's a similar thing that you can taste?
I think it's a really interesting concept that it would be nice to see applied more to the sort of realm of foods in general, and it certainly does make a difference. And we see it perhaps most obviously, or most clearly, where if you're growing cereal crops, one of the key things that is looked at for the cereal crop and how it might be used, whether it's suitable for bread making, is the protein content.
Yeah.
And that is really affected by the soil that you grow the cereal on. So there's a really direct relationship between the terroir, the type of soil where exactly the cereal is grown, and the nature of the crop that you get from it. But undoubtedly, I think all crops, they come from the soil and they're inevitably affected by the soil. And it's always struck me as slightly strange that we sort of apply more connoisseurship to drinks often than we do to food in terms of the ingredients. I think with food, we sort of look at the way it's cooked and the recipes rather than the very distinctive nature of the ingredients, and whether a pea from one field or one producer might actually have a different character to a pea from another one. And I guess maybe the difference is that when you're making wine, you're sort of bringing out the character of the grapes. When you're cooking, often because lots of different ingredients are involved, the character of the individual ingredients gets maybe slightly, the very specific character gets maybe very slightly lost amidst the range of ingredients. But it'd be nice to rediscover that. And in fact, my colleague Josiah has recently been doing some pea tastings where he's encouraged people just to taste different varieties of peas and peas from different places and compare the flavour of peas cooked and eaten very simply. And I think that's something we'd like to do more of, and really investigate more exactly how the terroir affects the pea or whatever the other crop is that comes out of it.
Yeah, well, I think there's something very much in the Mediterranean diet where it's, seasonal food that's eaten very simply, at the time when it's in season, and literally whether it's tomatoes that are in season right now, just slicing them with a bit of olive oil and salt, and that's it, and it's just absolutely delicious. You don't need to do more than that. So perhaps we'll get to the stage where we celebrate the seasonality and the things that are kind of locally grown here,
absolutely,
rather than thinking of it needing to be more complex than that.
Yeah.
So you also, as you mentioned, you've brought in lots of different produce and grains and so on. How do you make the selection of what you kind of like to start growing here in the UK that's not native?
So we're very led by what works from the farming point of view, and to some extent what farmers are already doing, and then also what might fit into farming rotations. So some of the crops that we work with, particularly, I guess, branching out from pulses into cereals is really just looking at one of the main families of plants that is a key part of any arable rotation. And if you're going to grow pulses, you're almost certainly also going to be growing cereals as part of that rotation. And then in terms of ingredients, if you're cooking with pulses, then, whatever you're eating really, unless you're avoiding gluten, you're likely to be eating cereals in many different forms. So that seemed a really important part of the sort of range of crops from British farming that we should be looking at, and looking at taking a slightly, as we have with the pulses, taking a slightly different approach and trying to move them away from just being a commodity that's produced with the maximum possible yield and looking just for consistency and volume of supply, but instead looking at some of these more varied characteristics and different approaches to farming, like, for example, the YQ population wheat, where Professor Martin Wolf, who we knew for many years and was a great mentor of ours and great inspiration to us, he'd set up a farm near where we're based in Suffolk called Wakelands Agroforestry, and he was really driven by exploring diversity on every level. So from having agroforestry where all his crops were grown in aisles between rows of trees, to looking at the diversity of the crops themselves. And in that, he developed the YQ population wheat, where he essentially created a population of wheat where every plant was genetically unique, rather than a typical monoculture modern variety where every plant in the field is genetically identical. And then that allows the different genetic characteristics to sort of adapt and be manifest in relation to where they're grown and how they're grown in the particular conditions that year, and produce a crop of extraordinary diversity, but also resilience. So we started working with Martin to look at opportunities to use his YQ wheat that he was growing really as a scientist. He was driven by looking at what would work and then measuring how it worked and how it grew. We really worked with him to then look at things to do with that flour and how to get that flour to bakers and encourage bakers to start using it, and how to find bakers like Kimberly Bell at the Small Food Bakery in Nottingham, who would use something that by its very nature was very sort of varied and variable, rather than being a consistent uniform product. But in doing that, to really uncover the wonder and the beauty of YQ wheat that, as we were talking about Terroir, sort of manifests the provenance of where it's from, and carries that character with it. So
exactly,
that's an example of something we were driven to do through connections of people we were working with, and seeing something exciting that we wanted to make more of.
I think that there's so much beauty in things that are not identical, and I think that I was listening to it was Fairfax, one of the co-founders of Sipsmith Gin,
talking
about how his father was a silversmith, and how obviously in the silversmith, when they get asked to make a batch of, let's say, tankards, you hold them from far away, they look exactly the same, but close up you notice the slight differences between them, and it's that gives it its charm. And people don't necessarily want something that is identical, because actually there's that value in it being the the provenance behind it, the work that's gone into it, and the differences are actually what makes it more special. And I think there's definitely something to be said there. I just wonder, with these kind of more traditional or different types of grains, from a nutritional perspective, are they sometimes more easy for the body to digest, do you think? Because there's a lot of difficulty, there's a lot of gluten intolerance out there, and some suggestion that it's because of the way it's farmed, and actually that older, more heritage grains and so on are perhaps more easy for us to digest, and that's where we should be kind of leaning towards that. And along with sometimes the fermentation, sourdoughs are better as well, but there's certain grains that are potentially better for us.
Yes, so I mean, modern wheat has essentially been really intensively bred over years and decades and centuries even to maximize yield and to increase the resistance to disease and to pests. That's what's driven breeding modern varieties. Flavour and nutrition don't come into it. That's not something that plant breeders are really asked to consider when they're breeding varieties of wheat or indeed other crops. So I think inevitably, when you're breeding with those particular characteristics as the aim, you're going to maximize the yield and you're going to improve the disease resistance, and modern wheat varieties, are amazing in those terms, but that's done at the expense of the flavour and the nutrition. And I think there clearly has been a change in the structure of the gluten, for example, where some people clearly can't eat gluten at all, and we should be clear that the gluten, all cereals contain gluten, and if people really can't eat gluten because they're suffering from celiac disease, then they shouldn't look at older wheats or older cereals as necessarily being okay. But I think where people have an intolerance to gluten that isn't celiac disease, then that may often be because of the structure of the gluten in modern wheat and other characteristics of the nutrition of the plant and how it's grown. And I think anecdotally, it does seem that a lot of people who do suffer from problems of gluten intolerance do find that older varieties where they've been less bred and the nutritional and gluten structure is different can often prove to be more digestible and less of a problem. And as you say, then traditional ways of preparing those cereals, particularly sourdough fermentation and baking, can also really help to modify the structure in a way that makes them more acceptable to our bodies. And that's essentially how we develop those techniques and why we develop those techniques to make the plants that we eat as suitable as possible for our bodies.
And I think they also have the benefit of just tasting absolutely delicious.
I mean, it's amazing.
Super hardwired.
Things go hand in hand.
Exactly.
You look at our sort of traditional knowledge of what to grow, how to grow it, and then how to use the results of that, and that results in food that is healthy and nutritious, but also delicious. And everything goes hand in hand, while also being produced in a sustainable way. So it's not a trade-off. It's a question of looking at all of the things coming together. But our modern food system has, along the way through its history, taken some turns that have led us away from that, and really, been driven to look at other characteristics like maximizing yield and maximizing consistency and providing the most opportunity for profit as well, that are all counter to those fundamental things about the food we eat.
So I'm just going to wrap up, but before I do, one final question. I kind of intrigued to know what's next. What, if you've got any things in mind that you're hoping to, big picture things that you're hoping to be moving towards with Hodmedods?
So we've always got a lot of different things going on, because we're always really interested and excited to explore different possibilities. So in fact, earlier this year, we bought a stone mill, so we've recently started milling our own flour, and we're really excited to be doing more of that and to make the most of the opportunity we now have with our own mill to mill small batches and talk to farmers about growing possibly very small quantities of very sort of specialist and unusual grains that we can then use and actually turn into flour without having the problem of needing a certain volume to be worth sort of having milled. And tied in with that, we're working very closely with Vanessa Kimball of the sourdough school, who's developed what she calls botanical blends, which are blends for milling of grains, pulses, seeds, and even flours, which then just really pack diversity into a grist that can then be milled to produce a flour and go into our bread. So you're really getting a huge diversity, and she has a very simple approach, simple but really clear approach to what that diversity is by giving those blends a diversity score, which is simply the number of different species in that blend. So what she calls her botanical blend number 2, for example, has a diversity score of 14 because it has 14 different species of plants in it. So we're already blending and milling that first blend, and we're really excited to be developing more of those and creating and then producing flour of more of those with Vanessa. And I guess just one other thing to mention that we're keen to explore more is fermenting the products we work with. We work with a fantastic fermenter in Wales who a few years now has been producing a fermented fava bean umami paste for us, and also fermented naked barley grains. And we're planning to explore further possibilities to ferment the products we work with, and potentially produce a fava bean based tamari that would be the equivalent of a soy sauce but produced from British grown fava beans.
Oh, that sounds amazing.
Even fermented black peas, which would be like a black bean. And there's a lot of exciting things that we've got up our sleeves.
Oh, well, wonderful. You've already got a lot for people to discover, but that all sounds like it's just even more exciting to know that there's more things to come. Anyway, thank you. I really appreciate you joining me, and for us to be able to follow on the conversation. It's been absolutely lovely to hear more. So thank you so much.
Great. Well, thanks so much for your interest, and it was wonderful to be introduced to your Mother Roots ritual, which is a really fabulous drink, and I think exemplifies a lot of things we've been talking about of coming from really good origins with good provenance and being a really delicious to boot. So it's been great to get to know you and your Mother Root.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Great. Good to finish the conversation.